Imagine waking up in the body of a complete stranger trapped in a mansion belonging to a family that's despised you since birth. That's the fate of Kana Addis, a girl born with jet black hair and eyes like dark fog symbols of disaster in her world. For 14 years, she endured contempt from her own flesh and blood, treated like an outcast, like a living curse. But one day she wakes up in the body of a girl named Li Yu Hua in the modern world, where she's loved, where she becomes a talented doctor. 12 blissful years pass, until she's dragged back to her old body, returned to a miserable marriage with the cold Duke Valentino and his cruel stepmother. But this time Kana is no longer the helpless girl she once was. She's changed, and they're going to pay dearly for what they've done. This is a story of survival, revenge, and reclaiming power in a world that tried to break her. Let's dive into Kana's incredible journey of transformation and vindication. A young girl found herself in a situation she didn't understand. She didn't know what had happened, and the situation terrified her. The heavy door slammed shut with a loud bang, and Kana was left alone in an unfamiliar room. However, now she could be away from the attention of others. The strength to decide on the next plan. The young woman calmed down and concluded that divorcing a man as horrible as Duke Valentino was the right decision in her current situation. Canny inspected the room. The Duke wasn't at the palace, so he could only announce the divorce the next day. The young woman climbed onto the bed, hoping the Duke would be there too, happy with her decision to annul the marriage just like she was. But there was a huge problem. Since Duke Alessandro Hadis, who was still her father, could deny his consent to the divorce, the Western continent is different from Korea, where Connie spent half of her life, which means only the father can approve the divorce, not the government authorities. Kenny clearly remembered her father's character, because in their last meeting he stated that his daughter was a scandal for the Addis family. Upon learning of his daughter's marriage, Duke Addis left and wished that Kenny's curse would pass to the Valentino family, not to the Addis. At that moment, the young woman was emotionally shattered, but she didn't have the courage to confront her father. Kenny reflected that if she were in another body, her father... A wave of anxiety flooded her mind, as the name Kana was very familiar to her. The girl took a deep breath. Li Yu Hua cared for her a lot, and would surely defend his daughter's honor if he knew how she was being treated. Heavy thoughts exhausted the young woman's mind. That's why she fell onto the bed, deciding that the best thing was to sleep well first, and then plan since Connie still believed it was just a bad dream. In the dark of her consciousness, a dream appeared. As if a little Connie approached her father with questions about her mother, the girl was very agitated. She didn't know what reaction to expect from her father. The man whose face was hidden by the semi-darkness turned sharply towards the voice. His eyes were overflowing with rage. He got up from his seat. Canny prepared herself for him to hit her, but a loud scream was heard in the room. The man demanded that his illegitimate son never mention his mother in his presence. The Duke leaned over the girl. His eyes shone with fury, but he repeated his order more firmly. The little girl broke free from his hands and ran to the other side of the room. She knew her father hated not only her mother, but also Canny. The hatred that existed in the Addis family extended not only to its members, but also to their friends. Trying to calm down, but it didn't work well. So gripping the hem of her dress, she repeated her name over and over. That's why, with every act from outsiders, Canny felt more abandoned than alone her brother's friends. Always mocked her dark hair, but they also convinced them to turn against her depending on others' opinions. Her brother Orsini became the main bully and channeled his anger directly onto Kanai to maintain his status as a leader among his friends. Orsini supported his insults and personally started fights with Connie. The dream was suddenly cut off, and the young woman woke up in the same bed at the Valentine estate. The first thing Connie saw was a vase with cold water that they had splashed on her. The girl sat up in bed when a tall maid leaned over her. The maid looked at her with disdain and wondered why she was still in bed. Kana wiped the water droplets from her face, trying to calm down after a restless dream. She looked around the room. Was the same, which meant that the body change had become real. I wasn't prepared for that truth. It would have been better if it had all just been a bad dream. The maid caught her attention with shouts and demands that Kana leave the Duke's bed. Finally managing to control her emotions, the girl looked around and with relief realized that she had returned to her body. The woman was very rude and demanding. When Kana turned to look at her, she realized that being a 14-year-old girl, she wouldn't have said anything in response to the maid's shouting if Kana hadn't changed during her stay in the other body. Now, she would be shaking with fear and trying to escape. But when she shot her a calm look, she understood that her personality had already changed. The girl tried to be nice and asked the maid what her name was, although a memory suddenly arose in Kana's mind, showing how the same maid had hit her. In the face, the woman was also impatient since the lady had fallen asleep again. Before in Kana's body was Li Yu Hua. That's why she couldn't confront the bossy maid and just accepted the punishments, always apologizing for any faults the memory ended. But Kana recalled the maid's name and addressed her. Mary examined the girl skeptically. She noticed that something had changed, but it seemed to her that she was still indeed Kana. The maid straightened up and declared that the lady shouldn't pretend to be foolish, but should get up and go greet the lady. The authoritative tone amused Kana. Of course, she remembered Mary Goldian and the morning ritual of greeting the lady. She was Kana Addis, a member of the second family of guardians that protected the Western continent. The young woman leaned back on the pillow and firmly stated that she had no intention of meeting the lady or anyone else. The maid's mood changed abruptly. But Kana didn't like being carelessly called lady when her hair was lifted. Kana demanded to be called madam since she was the owner of this mansion, and the Duchess of Val and Mary was outraged by such impertinent behavior. But then the maid realized that any attempt by the young woman to pretend to be a noble aristocrat, she could easily stop it. The servants knew that the Duke of Valen did not pay attention to the young woman, and that her title of Duchess was just for show. Even the Addis family after the marriage never showed interest in Kaina's life. But even the noble marriage with Valen did not free her from the stigma of shame, and all the aristocrats treated her like the worst curse in the world. Mary knew that no one would care about the young woman's life. That's why she confidently stated that the only owner of the Valen mansion was Mrs. Josephina. An uncomfortable silence took over the room, after which Kaina demanded that the maid hand her the water jug, not waiting. But being the eldest daughter of Duke Hades, she bore the mark of an illegitimate child, hence her impure blood. For her request to be fulfilled, the young woman seized the dishware from the maid's hands with a quick glance at the jug. She noticed there was a little water, and in the next instant the young woman tipped the dishware over Mary's head, spilling ice-cold water on the maid, proudly raising her chin. Kaina declared that maids couldn't be so arrogant. While Mary was in shock, Kaina shouted at the maids to bring the whip to her bedroom. The young woman snatched the instrument from another maid's hands. Her actions alarmed the entire staff with a slight movement of the whip. Kaina ordered Mary to expose her calves for the chastisement. Mary was petrified, her face flushed with anger, but she didn't know how to act in that situation. Unable to bear the tension, the staff began to scream about their importance in this house. Since she had been there longer than Kaina and trusted Mrs. Josephina with her behavior, expressive didn't shake Kaina's determination. The young woman scolded Mary and reminded her that she was just a maid who dared to splash water on her lady. The young woman pushed the whip against the maid's chest and promised to re-educate her. This was the reason her whole family distanced themselves from her. As a child, Kaina was an outcast because of her black hair and eyes, for it was the duty of a duchess. Kaina lashed out with the whip again. Her threat was stronger than the previous one. Now she swore to punish the entire staff if Mary did not accept the punishment. The maid could barely contain her emotions. She couldn't believe she was trapped by some young lady. Kaina did not want to wait any longer and demanded that the maid reflect on the fate of the other maids. A little later, Mary grabbed the hem of her dress and lifted it, deciding to accept the punishment in silence, although her face burned with fury. Kaina noticed the maid's fear, but worried whether Mary had guessed the changes in her. The young woman looked at the whip suddenly. A voice in her mind, that of her mother from another life, reminded her that any punishment should be done correctly. Kaina was sure she had to defend herself. That's why her hand with the whip raised in the next moment. The maid received a blow, but she bravely held back from screaming. After the first strike, the young woman did not stop and landed several more. The maid continued standing and endured the blows. But then Mary couldn't resist anymore, and with tears in her eyes acknowledged her guilt before the Duchess. Terrified those around her, so all she could do was listen to the insults directed at her. The maid fell to her knees. Kaina demanded an apology for daring to splash her with water and hitting her in the face to wake her up. Mary called her lady again, but seeing the young woman's threatening look, she began to excuse herself and promised to call her madame from now on. The young woman threw the whip to the ground and promised that the punishment would be much more severe next time. Kaina sat on the bed. Such a tense morning took a lot of strength from her, but still she shouted at the servants to leave the room. In the hallway, a thud was heard, and Mary stood frozen in the doorway. Kaina looked toward the sound, already understanding that a punishment wouldn't change the ingrained habits of this property. Now she regretted the reverse exchange, since Li Yuhua had not managed to gain any status in this mansion. When Kaina lived Li Yuhua's life in this recap manhwa, she did manage to improve that young woman's life. Hard work allowed her to graduate from a prestigious university and become a traditional medicine doctor. But a tight schedule didn't prevent her from starting a relationship with a nice guy. However, Li Yuhua did the opposite for Kaina's life. She turned it into an unbearable trial now for Kaina. Never confronting her aggressors in the world where she was born, Kaina faced a disaster that had manifested since ancient times. Hades was not only the despicable daughter in the Hades family, but also the mockery of the Valentino household. Although she was once an aristocrat, no one considered her noble. That's why every reception or guest visit at the Hades estate ended with an endless torrent of curses behind Kaina. Every aristocrat meeting ended with the nobles looking at her with disdain. That's why Li Yuhua wasn't prepared for such a life. At one of the social dinners, everything changed when Duke Valentino visited the Addis estate. As soon as Li Yuhua saw the man at the threshold, she fell into the damn whirlwind of infatuation. The memories of Kaina ended with the noise in the hallway. It turned into a horrifying scream, demanding that the door be opened immediately. Josephina Elister. She burst into the room with several aides. The lady was disgusted with Kaina's behavior since Mary had told her everything. The countess scrutinized the young woman with an arrogant look, waved her fan, and asked Kaina to demonstrate to the maids. And what obedience was with her own example. Kaina already knew that the countess was the stepmother of Duke Silvio and Valentino, and the true owner of this estate. Josephina was upset because Kaina had ignored the order and hadn't gone to greet the owner of the... It appeared as a sudden black fog that had completely ravaged the southern continent in ancient times. With hair and eyes the color of the black fog, estate at breakfast. The young woman was calm, but just the fact that they demanded such behavior put her on alert. Li Yuhua became a prisoner of the situation and obeyed the countess's orders. That's why she attended every meal and greeted the lady. Over time, the countess showed more authority and even prohibited leaving the estate. That's why Li Yuhua followed the whimsical demands. Kana couldn't be angry with the young woman since she was probably trying to earn a bit of love in this house. However, the consequences of such actions now filled Kana with sadness as she found herself in a complicated situation. The girl understood that Li Yuhua's past decisions couldn't be fixed soon. Her old habits needed to be eradicated, and she couldn't please those who treated her poorly. To avoid that, she had to understand how to live correctly since childhood. Even despite the Hades family's criticisms, Kana admitted that she hadn't forgotten the lady's demands, but then with a bit of determination, she announced that she didn't want to keep submitting to silly requirements. Her future shouldn't suffer because of the past. The Duchess Josephina Ellister became Sylvia's stepmother when the boy was only 10 years old, but after the death of the previous duke. She was gripping the pants of a stranger trying to hold him back, but she didn't even know who he was. People saw her as a threat, and her mere existence was considered a grave sin, which is why all the looks from those who knew her. She managed to maintain her position as the lady of the castle. The Duchess was confident in her superiority, so she didn't hesitate to cause any harm to Kana and Li. When Josephine heard Kana's bold declaration, she couldn't believe it. No one in this house had dared to disobey her before. Kana got up from the bed, repeated her stance to the Duchess, and didn't back down. Josephine was confused just a few days ago. The young woman acted like the most loyal servant, willing to fulfill any request, but now Kana's eyes shone with bravery and determination. The woman suddenly approached, hit her with the fan, and demanded that she respect the customs of her home while being the Duke's wife. Kana pushed the fan away from her face and reminded the Duchess that family rules and hers were two different things. The expression on the Duchess amused Kana. She laughed at how the woman tried to seem like an important family member, but such an attitude only embarrassed the Valentines. The young woman's words surprised the Countess, who immediately ordered that the rude girl be arrested. The attendants rushed towards the girl, halting her hands, preventing her from backing away. Mary brought the lady the whip, were filled with evident disdain towards her. The disdain was also shown by the members of the Hades family, who kept away from her. Her stepmother, for she was furious and determined to teach Kana some manners. The young woman expected this approach from the Countess, as only with force could she momentarily maintain power in the state. Mary adjusted Kana's skirt so that the whip would strike the girl's legs. The girl abruptly pulled the maid's hands from her dress, startling the woman. Kana lifted the hem of her dress, raised it, and defiantly shouted at the Countess that she was ready to play by the rules of this house. Such brave attitude aggravated Josephine's anger. Her fiery fury grew. Now she wanted to teach, even more forcefully, the appropriate lessons to the girl. The situation amused Kana. The girl bowed to the lady, and smiling asked to demonstrate the disciplinary teachings. The servant sat Kana on the floor so she wouldn't escape. While the Countess, waving the whip, approached, the girl laughed upon seeing the Countess justifying her noble status. For a daughter-in-law's education is given through punishments. But then Kana remembered that Duke Valentino would approve of this educational method, a phrase that terrified the woman. To hide her fear, the Countess cracked the whip and began the punishment. And younger sister didn't hide their disgust at seeing Kana. Her younger brother would often start arguments with her that ended in fights where Kana couldn't defend herself. An echo of a strong crack of the whip resonated through the room, but Kana made no sound. The Countess lost control and began to strike the girl's legs relentlessly with the whip, but Kana gripped the hem of her dress tighter and began to endure the pain. Many maids watched the punishment from the hallway, but they dared not intervene in the process. Despite the new strikes, Kana did not dare to scream or show her pain, causing the Countess's attendants to be surprised by her composure. Although the girl's suffering entertained Mary, she did not hide her malicious smile. More strikes echoed in the room. Kana understood that everyone was watching her, but she was indifferent. Nobody dared to stop Josephine, and the prolonged punishment scared Mary upon seeing the girl's injuries. Kana resisted with all her strength. Now the entire staff saw that the girl had undergone unexpected changes. Only in one night her legs were too hurt. But after a few more hits, blood marks appeared on her. The Countess stopped to catch her breath, even though she was burning with rage inside at the fact that her daughter-in-law wasn't going to give up or admit guilt. However, her second brother always pretended to be nice, but treated her as if she were a servant in the Duke's palace. As so many times before, Kana didn't stay quiet for long, but her phrase surprised the woman when she tried to acknowledge her guilt. Josephina smiled wickedly, convinced that she made her daughter-in-law admit to making a mistake. But Kana didn't give up and firmly stated that she was only guilty of letting the servants and the Duchess abuse her life like that. The girl reasoned that she shouldn't spend every day in the Countess's company. Kana proudly shrugged her shoulders and declared that she was the owner of the castle and that Josefina was just a guest staying there. The staff didn't expect such impertinence. Josefina began to suffocate with fury at being belittled and called just a simple guest. The daughter-in-law was calm, knowing that according to noble laws, the estate always belonged only to the new Duke and his wife, not to the widow of the previous Count. Kana advised the Duchess to submit and try to live in a separate house, but she took that humiliation with strong bewilderment. Josephine remembered how, as a young aristocrat, she ended up married to Sylvian's father, then attracting the attention of other duchesses. But all this wasn't so sad because there was still the father who only watched how they treated her and did nothing. She was a noble famous for receiving thank you notes or event invitations easily at any dinner. And she was never short of expensive gifts while Sylvian's father was alive, that's why. Every aristocratic gathering became more interesting with Josephine's presence. Suddenly, the woman imagined that there would be no more encounters with influential people, and that Kana would take her place as the hostess at the table. The servants whom Josephine had trained so hard to be loyal would start to attend to Cana and receive gratitude for it. Once all that happened, Josephine would be left with loneliness and the lost influence among the nobility. The woman regained her composure. Her thoughts were still filled with terror, but she tried to maintain a confident posture in front of her daughter-in-law. However, her efforts were in vain. Josephine grabbed Cana by the collar of her dress and started shaking her. Instantly, the countess froze. The woman's body swayed and began to fall. Cana lay motionless on the ground. The room fell silent. Despite the beauty of her soul, she lived each day overcoming the hatred that burned in the Hades family. Cana lived 14 years in that situation. But no servant hurried to help the duke's wife. The girl was breathing with difficulty, but opened her eyes slightly and looked at the maids. Josephine ordered all the servants not to help her until she acknowledged all the blame for the insults directed at the lady of the estate. Cana began to lose consciousness as the room darkened while the countess headed for the exit and gave orders that no one visit Cana in the palace. Night fell deeply, and all the lights in the building went out. They were already turned off after the incident of the day. Josephina was still angry, and although she was in her chambers, she shouted threats against Cana. The woman was furious for allowing Sylvain to marry, an illegitimate child of the Hades family, instead of the expected one with the second imperial princess. Josephina knew that her rank as countess was just a false title she held by force, but the lost opportunity to join the imperial family troubled her. Constantly, the countess imagined again that Cana would become the owner of the palace, and she would lose all her power even though even now as a countess she had no assets or money. But one day when she woke up, she saw a strange landscape through the window at that moment, but with Cana's new behavior, she would definitely lose everything. Rage clouded her mind. She only thought about Cana not surviving the night. After falling at her feet, the servants reported that the wounds were very serious, and the daughter-in-law had a high fever. Josefina decided to leave things as they were and pretend she had nothing to do with the wounds. The countess smiled wickedly, hoping that soon everything would take the turn she desired. The woman lay down on the sofa. Future plans relaxed her, so she began to dream about how, after Cana's death, she would push Sylvain to reunite with the imperial princess. A knock was heard at the door. The assistant informed of the visit from Duke Valentino, which scared the woman. The door opened slightly and a man entered silently. Josefina was terrified and looked at Sylvain, but she feared he had come alone to her chambers. The countess jumped off the sofa and approached her son to greet him. Her thoughts were filled with worry about the incident with Cana, which could have caught the duke's attention, so she had to come up with an excuse. Sylvain passed silently by his stepmother, a behavior that increased the woman's anxiety. Her life took an unexpected turn, and when she got out of bed, Cana realized she was now in the body of a girl named Lee. The man did not respond to her questions about the late visit. He simply sat on one of the sofas after regaining his composure. Josefina kindly offered her son tea and assured him he could stay as long as he wanted in her chambers. The young man's silence created tension, so the woman began to laugh nervously and insisted once again that he have the tea. The atmosphere in this room changed abruptly. Duke Valentino continued to sit silently on the sofa. After waiting a moment, the man stated that today he had heard strange news which left his stepmother stunned. The woman curled up on the sofa, fearing that Cana would take an important place in her adoptive son's life. That's why he had come to get rid of her. But Josefina relaxed instantly upon hearing Sylvain mention that only today he had learned of the need to visit the second princess's birthday. The woman began to smile happily, that now the conversation would not revolve around her hated daughter-in-law, and she could push the duke to get closer to the imperial family. Josefina proudly announced that Princess Lillian was personally interested in Duke Valentino, which is why in her role as a mother she promised her visit to the birthday. Yu Hua, examining her new body in the mirror, found nothing in common with her real appearance. Now her hair was light in her body. The duke remained motionless in front of his stepmother, feeling there were hidden motives behind her actions. As he observed her closely, Sylviane, she asked in a cold tone, what right she had to promise something in his name. Josefina lost the ability to speak. The duke had never been so cold with her. Sylvia decided to punish his arrogance and demanded an answer from the countess. Elster had the right to decide for the duke what the woman should do. She anxiously held her wrists and whispered insecurely that she only fulfilled the princess's request, who hadn't seen the duke in a while and missed their conversation. Sylvian. He was furious at his stepmother's attitude for plotting behind his back and threatened that the Countess Elston had to accompany the princess if she had the right to do so. The man stood up from the sofa without waiting for a response from his stepmother and stated that the conversation was over. The duke headed for the door, but Josephine was so scared that she didn't even turn to him. She was so nervous that she gripped her hands tightly until she cut her skin on her wrists. But as soon as the door closed behind the duke, she managed to relax a little. In the room, there were no servants. A few years more mature. The girl screamed in horror as she couldn't believe how much her face had changed. So she spent the day lying on the floor and woke up when the moonlight entered through the window. Her body was so weak that it trembled. She tried to sit up, propping her hands on the floor, but her head kept spinning, preventing her from calculating how long she had been unconscious. She felt her body burning, so she took a quick glance at her injured legs and was surprised by the severity of the injuries, although her dress hid part of the damage. Seeing the amount of blood, she realized that recovery would take her a long time. She reached for the hem of the dress and tried to separate the fabric stuck to her skin. While inspecting all the damage, she was horrified to realize that her inner strength wasn't strong enough to have allowed them to do that. Her head spun again and she fell back to the floor. Fatigue closed her eyes on their own, preventing her from moving. Even though her body had no strength, her mind was analyzing the situation and proposing a solution. She had to attend to the wounds to avoid infections and worse consequences. A thought crossed her mind that she could die, and that fear made her sit up again on the floor of the room. Kana realized that the cunning countess wanted her dead, which is why no doctor visited her all day. The girl looked up at the stranger when he asked her to let go of his pants. The guy adjusted his tie. Kana moved in front of the mirror, still trying to appreciate all the changes. When suddenly it occurred to her that maybe her obsession with alchemy, gathering her strength, Kana began to slowly drag herself toward the bed. The anger at seeing that the people of this palace were willing to commit repulsive acts motivated her to not give up and keep moving, holding onto the blanket. Kana reached the edge of the bed and almost managed to get up. Now she had gone to war with the local rules, but no one in this palace would expect her death, as she would heal herself. Through the window the full moon shone, and Kana found a bottle of alcohol in the room and used a sheet to make bandages, with which he began to treat his wounds. He decided to apply alcohol to the injury, so that the alcohol contained could disinfect the deep cuts on his legs, however. Before doing so, he noticed something out the window of the room, moving the wine bottle aside. He observed the garden. Brightly lit by the moonlight in front of the window grew a huge tree that looked very familiar to him. As he slowly crossed the distance to the window, he went out to the garden and immediately checked that the aroma of the tree would be of great help. He remembered that the tree in the garden was called cinnamon, and that in Korea it was a medicinal plant according to his knowledge, had caused something unexpected. She tried to convince herself that she wasn't crazy, but time kept passing. Any part of this tree was useful for creating medicines that effectively cured various bruises. Finding such a plant was an unexpected miracle, since in the wild cinnamon only grows in the east, and Valerio Palace is in the west. He meditated, trying to remember something from Li Yuhua's memories. From a few years ago, the Countess had the hobby of collecting plants from the east in the family garden. That's why she forced Li Yuhua to plant cinnamon that day. Li Yu tried to improve her relationship with her mother-in-law and advised her to care for the plants with mana stones. Otherwise, the western climate would kill the tree. Fragments of memories faded. He realized that even the care of the tree was not suitable. Although the idea of using mana stones was excellent, the young woman's spirits improved. Such luck would serve her well, and she could prepare a good remedy for her cuts. Gathering a few leaves, he crushed them with a bottle to make an ointment. Upon assessing the result, the young woman decided that this ointment would be enough to relieve the first symptoms of the infection. First, she sprayed alcohol from the bottle on the wound to disinfect it. But the burning sensation upon contact of the alcohol with the cuts, and her soul remained trapped in the body of a stranger. She had no choice but to accept the situation and stop searching for answers. It was unbearable, causing him to let out a prolonged scream. After overcoming the pain, the young woman applied the ointment to the wounds. And with bandages she performed a dressing. Pushing the tray with medications away, she fell weakly back onto the bed. It was a very late night, and the day had brought nothing good to him. He feared that the remedies would not be enough, and if the body swap had not occurred, he wouldn't have gotten into such a dangerous situation. The young woman began to dream that if she were still in Korea, she would have taken the Countess to the police, and the hospital doctors would have taken care of her treatment. Although now she wished that at least she had nearby a small first aid kit with good medical materials. He recalled Li Yuhua's mother again. While they were in different bodies, she had already gotten used to the new family. That's why in such difficult moments, she always turned to her mother's advice after resting a bit. He decided that the situation was not worth her tears. That's why she had to focus all her strength on correcting the mistakes the young woman understood. That despite her desire to return, since time was moving on and she had to keep up with it, Kana's most important decision was that now her soul was in Li Yuhua's body. She could no longer do so. So the only way out was to rebuild her life. Silvio arrived at his quarters. When one of the stewards informed him of the incident between the Countess and his wife, the man listened silently to the report. But the steward wondered what to do with the wife, since the Duchess had ordered no help to be given. Silvio listened to the assistant, but he reminded him that Countess Esther handled all internal matters of the estate as he walked away from the steward. He implied that the conversation was over. Silvio headed to the office. Joselina's suspicions were correct. Indeed, he didn't care at all what happened to Kana on his property, and his cold attitude towards the young woman meant a death sentence. If she decided to stay in the Valentine family at the Valentine house, a new day was breaking. One of the maids was carrying a tray with food to Kana